Shifting on modern mountain bikes tends to be very accurate and consistent. However, even when your rear derailleur is accurately set up, there are a number of things that can affect that ultimate gear shift. So here's how you sort them all out and get accurate shifting. So first things first, we're going to start at the front of the bike, the business end here, with the shifter. And in this case, I'm going to remove the existing cable that's on there. I'm going to keep that for use later on another bike. I'm going to put a fresh cable in here and show you all the things you need to be looking for to make sure that your shifting is clean, smooth and accurate. So in this particular case, it's a SRAM shifter. So I'm just using a Torx T25 to remove it from the clamp on the bars. Now I've already loosened off the cable at the back of the bike, so I'm just going to pull the cable through the outer. And there's a bit of friction on that actually, so it goes to show that it is a good time to replace this. So it's a 3mm Allen key in this case, just to remove the cap on the top of the shifter. Exposing the spring on the inside and where you can push the cable out from. And there we go, and I'll just remove this cable. So the gear shifter is something that's often forgotten about on a bike. The reason for that is it stays under your handlebars and out of harm's way. Now they can get sticky from time to time, especially if you ride in a lot of wet conditions or perhaps some dry and dusty conditions as well. Now, although they're quite well sealed, it's definitely worth giving them a clean out. And I personally like to use a bit of light spray grease just to get on the inside here. The reason I like to use that instead of a lube is I can get it exactly where I want to and it will stay there as well. And because they're well sealed, it tends to stay there for quite a long time. So it's well worth just running some on the inside there just before you put your new fresh cable inside. Now, depending on which particular shifter you have, whether you have a SRAM or a Shimano, it does differ on the way that you install the cables. Typically on the SRAM ones, you remove the top and you slide the cable straight in. But on some of the cheaper ones, like the NX ones, there's a little hole where you can slide the cable straight in, which is very similar to the way you would do it on a Shimano one, which has that little rubber cap that you just pop off. So delicately slide that cable in and make sure it comes straight out in the correct place until it locates as it should do. Now you can just confirm the action of the shifter by running the cable just around the back of your hand. Not too tight, but just enough to put a bit of tension on it, and this will simulate the sort of tension you're likely to get from the rear derailleur. And you can just cycle it through the gears, just to confirm that it's definitely pulling the cable nice and smoothly. When you're downshifting, it's a good idea to just pull that cable away from the shifter. That's the sort of action the rear mech would give. So now I know that that is okay, I'm going to replace the cap, reinstall the shifter onto the bars. Now, just before we move on to the next process, you want to wind that barrel adjuster in, so that's a clockwise action until it stops. Reason for that is used to take out the slack in the cable, which you need later on for indexing those gears. Now, something that I like to do is wind it all the way in and then unwind it one full turn. So the reason I like to have that extra turn basically at the shifter end is because it's very easy to pull up too much cable at the rear derailleur end, and if you mess around pulling cable through too much, you can actually fray that cable and make it a bit of a bad state. So I tend to like to pull that through once, tighten it, secure it and leave it, and then just make the adjustments from the shifter end. Of course, that is my personal preference. So outer housing is the next thing you really need to pay attention to. So firstly, if you're putting a new cable in, you want to make sure it's lubricated on the inside, but more importantly, you want to double check the routing. Now, your outer cable housing should take the most direct route possible straight to the rear derailleur. If it has to have curves in it, they should be gradual and not acute angles. As soon as you've got a tight angle that the cable has to go through, there's going to be added friction, which is definitely going to affect those gear shifts. In this particular case, I've got internal routing, so it can only go a distinct way through there. But something I do have to factor in is the length of outer cable coming out the front of the bike here. Now, this one has been cut before, so I know it's the correct length, but a way to check this is to offer it up to your shifter and turn the bars around and make sure you've got enough room. In this particular case, there's a steering lock on this bike to protect the top tube from damage. So I know that that's the correct amount of outer housing I have. Sometimes you need to have a little extra outer housing to enable the bars to spin all the way around without pulling anything out at this end. And the same applies at the other end of the bike. Now again, it's really important to take into account the cable routing on your particular bike. On my Nukeproof, for example, the cables run on the top of the down tube and they run over the bottom bracket shell and towards the rear end. So they're not really subject to movement issues when there's suspension. On this bike, they go on the inside of the down tube and they come out to the bottom bracket shell and go underneath and then back into the chainstay. So therefore, when the suspension is moving, it can create a tight patch under the bottom bracket shell here. So it's really important to make sure it has enough movement so it's not hampering the gear shifting. Best way to do this is either to remove your rear shock or to deflate it, and then cycle the rear end through its travel, and you can see if there's any pinching spots for that outer casing. If you do choose to deflate your shock rather than remove it, it's well worth taking a note of the air pressure that's in there, just because it makes it a lot easier and faster to re-inflate and get back out on the trails once you finish this process. So in this case, I've chosen to just remove the upper shock bolt, so that's a 5mm bolt just holding it on there. Just sliding the shock out of harm's way there. And I'm just going to cycle the rear end through its movement and just make sure that those outer cables aren't being pulled too tightly. You can also check this by looking at the rear derailleur end and make sure that outer cable isn't being pulled into the chainstay. So it's getting pulled, but it's not changing anything at the back end of the bike where the shifting is. So that suggests to me that this is a good routing. So we've confirmed that the outer cable is the correct length, it's not being pulled too tight in any place, and suspension action doesn't affect the length of that cable. So we know that that's one less thing that's going to affect the shifting. That in combination with a new inner cable and a smooth shifter means that this end of the bike will be completely sorted. Final thing to do just before sliding that inner cable into the outer housing is just to flush it through with some clean lubricant. Now, when you do this, make sure that you have some shop towel or rag at hand, because you don't want any spray to get anywhere near your disc brakes or your disc brake rotors or the pads. Same with the front and rear of the bike. Now, before you move to the rear derailleur end of the bike, you just want to make sure that your chainring teeth, your chain and your cassette are in good enough condition that there can't be anything else to affect it. What we're looking for is things like a stiff link or any damaged chain links. So it's good to just cycle everything past and just keep an eye on things, make sure everything is rotating smoothly and there's no additional resistance in there. So before you start making any adjustments to the rear derailleur itself, it's important to just inspect the condition of it and make sure it's aligned correctly. Now, depending on the model of bike you have, there will be a different derailleur hanger that's part of the frame. On my Nukeproof, for example, that's held on by two individual Allen key bolts, so occasionally they can work loose and that will definitely affect your gear shifting. In this case, it's part of the frame on here, so I know that's not going anywhere. And you just generally want to have a little waggle around and make sure the rear neck isn't too wobbly with age. See, this one's got a bit of a creak to it, but it's nothing a bit of oil won't cure. But it's generally straight, and what you're looking for is to make sure that that upper guide wheel is completely straight and in line with the lower sprocket there. So the aim of adjusting that limit screw for the smallest sprocket here is to make sure the chain is completely passing straight underneath it. There should be no resistance from the derailleur to that. If you've got it wrong, it's going to sound a bit more like this. That's not what you want. You want the chain to just be passing smoothly through there. And then you want to repeat the same process for the bigger sprocket to make sure it lines up with that. Now you might have to do this manually, or you can do this once you've secured the cable. I would personally always recommend to do this manually so you can check that it won't go as far as jumping into the spokes. So with the limit screws adjusted high and low, so you know your derailleur is going to adjust to the correct points there. Next one is to secure that inner cable. Now you just want to make sure you run it through correctly, follows the little wheel roll around the back, and the guide straight under the derailleur. You just want to secure that bolt, but you don't want to pull the cable too tight. It's a case of pull it taut, and then you can pick up the adjustment with the barrel adjuster. If you pull it too tight, you're actually going to start shifting the gears. You're actually going to struggle to get the chain to sit on that smallest sprocket. So with that cable secured, what you're looking for is indexing. So that's 1 click per gear shift. Now, if you don't have enough cable tension on this cable, you can adjust this at the barrel adjuster. And remember at the beginning, I said I like to have that 1 turn on the shifter already. That is because if you have too much, you can actually undo it again. So if you don't have enough, the chain will not jump up the first sprocket. If you have too much, it might go too far and be rattly on the following sprocket. It's just a case of getting the chain to shift smoothly from the smaller sprocket to the first 2 or 3 and back again. If it does that correctly, you'll find it will do it throughout the whole cassette, provided your limit screws have been adjusted correctly. Next up is to trim that inner cable and fit a cable end cap. Now only use a decent set of quality cable cutters for this. If you don't, you're going to fray that cable and it just creates a bit of a mess. Further down the line, make sure you use a cable end cap as well. Helps keep things in check, and make sure the cable won't unravel and get tangled up in other parts of the bike. So that is nice and neat. And you're ready for your final adjustment, which is the B tension. Now, B tension is referring to the height of the derailleur upper guide wheel in relation to the sprockets. Now, there's differing measurements depending if you're running SRAM or Shimano, and they also recommend you do those adjustments in different ways. Now, SRAM make one of these little gizmos, and this is for correctly getting that spacing of the sprocket gap there. And what you're looking for is a 15mm gap, but this needs to be done with the sagged weight of the bike, so you may need some help from a friend to do this, to check that measurement whilst you're sat on the bike. Now, Shimano has slightly different measurements. If you're running up to a 42 tooth, it's between 4 and 6mm, and it's above 8mm if you're running above a 46 tooth. Now, it does vary from bike to bike, but SRAM say their measurements should be done with a sagged rear end, where Shimano is not. So just get that measurement correctly, and I'll just show you how much difference this can make on the bike. So this is the B tension, or the B screw, and it's simply just the height of that jockey wheel in relation to the sprockets. So the idea of the B tension is to make sure that the derailleur does shift correctly up into that sprocket, and also under compression of the rear suspension, that sprocket cannot get fouled. So if you have too much B tension, that is with the screw wound in, like this derailleur here, you can see there's barely any room for error. So if the transmission chain was too short, under full compression, there's a danger that it could snap the chain, but more likely you're going to snap that rear derailleur. It's one of the reasons you really do need to get this adjustment correct. Once it's done, you'll probably find you never have to do it again, so get it done right and it will serve you well. So there you go, they are all the factors that go into the perfect gear shift. Now just remember, it's not all about the rear derailleur. Once that's adjusted, it will work, but there are other things on your bike that can affect your shifting. So hopefully that has been a useful video for you and shown you a few things to check out on your own bikes at home. For a couple more useful videos, click down here if you want to see Emily Batty's Pro bike. That's a Trek Top Fuel, absolutely tiny size, small, with a few cool prototype bits on that. Check that one out, it's a good video that. And if you want to find out how to fix a tubeless tyre slash, so that's something in the sidewall of a tyre, click up here and it shows you how to renew that tyre and get it seated tubeless all over again. As always, click on that globe to subscribe. We have brand new content for you every single week. And if you found this video helpful or you like it, give us a thumbs up.